It's truly wonderful to welcome you, dear viewers and listeners, to today's real-life story. I sincerely hope you will find comfort and relaxation in the story I'm about to share. When I was 10 years old, my family went through a huge crisis, a crisis we never saw coming. One day, after coming home from school, my mother coldly declared that in a few months she would be moving abroad to live with another man. That man was none other than her former lover, someone she had been deeply in love with when they were both in high school. They had been inseparable during their senior year, but after graduation, he left for his studies and life abroad, and they lost contact. Time passed, but then fate stepped in. Years later, they unexpectedly reconnected at a high school reunion celebrating their 10th anniversary. It was at this moment that my mother fell back into the arms of her old lover, and they rekindled their passion. This man promised to sponsor her move abroad so that they could start a new life together. However, there was one condition. He was insistent that my mother leave me behind. It was clear that he loved my mother deeply, but he had no interest in me. I, the result of a hasty marriage between my mother and my father, was like a thorn in his side. Reluctantly, my mother agreed to leave me behind with my father and grandmother. My grandmother, furious, berated my mother. "You foolish woman," she yelled. "You're throwing away everything for a man. You're willing to abandon your own child for love? How can you live with yourself? Why can't you just stay with your husband? He never loved you, did he?" She continued, voice shaking with anger. "When I arranged your marriage to him, I thought you were a good, obedient girl. I thought he would love and care for you, but look at you now. Every day you two argue. He criticizes you over the smallest things. How can you stand it?" My grandmother's words stung, but I couldn't help but feel she had a point. Even though my father and mother lived under the same roof, their relationship was anything but harmonious. There was no affection, no warmth. It seemed like they were living in two different worlds. I often noticed the framed photograph of a woman on the small table in our living room. This woman, though I had no idea who she was, seemed to haunt the house. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. Her beauty was calm and serene, yet there was a sadness in her eyes, a sadness that seemed to suggest she had seen many hardships in her life. Every time I looked at that picture, it felt like she was watching me, following my every move, observing my every step. It was as if she knew everything about me. But what hurt the most wasn't the photo or the coldness of my parents' relationship. It was knowing that my mother was choosing to leave me, to leave her own child behind for a man she had barely known in recent years. How could she abandon me, I thought. Didn't she understand that a mother's love should come before everything else? Was her love for this man stronger than the bond we shared? The day my mother left, I saw her face, swollen and red from crying. She kissed me goodbye, and I could feel her tears soaking into my cheek. "Be good, listen to your father, and study hard," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll come back for you. Once I've settled over there, I'll bring you to live with me. I promise I won't leave you forever." "Mom, don't go," I cried, my heart breaking as I watched her walk away. She disappeared down the road, her figure growing smaller with every step. I wanted to run after her, to call out for her to stay, but my grandmother stopped me, grabbing my arm tightly. "No, you mustn't run after her. She made her choice," she scolded. At that moment, I didn't understand. Why had she left? Why had she chosen him over us? It wasn't until later, much later, that I learned the painful truth about my parents' relationship. My father and mother had never been truly in love. Their marriage had been arranged by my grandmother. My mother had lost contact with her first love, the man she had cared for in high school. My father, meanwhile, had just come out of a divorce. He was seeking companionship, and she too was looking for someone. They came together in a time of desperation, not love. They had me, yes, but there was no real connection between them. Their marriage had been a union of convenience, not affection. I learned all of this much later. from neighbors and family friends who had known the story. They told me that my father had once been married to a beautiful and talented woman, the mother of his first child. The two had been happy together for years, but she too had left him when they couldn't have children. She had been unable to bear him a son, and my grandmother, fearing that the family line would die out, had forced my father into another marriage, this time with my mother. This was a truth I could hardly bear, but it explained everything. It explained the coldness between my parents, the lack of love, and most of all, it explained why my mother had chosen to leave. Her journey, her decision, and the choices she made shaped not only her future but also mine. And as I look back, I can't help but wonder, was she wrong to leave? Was it truly her love for him that made her abandon her family? Or was it the yearning for something she had lost, something that had never really existed in her life with my father? In the end, I may never know. But one thing is clear, life is full of choices, and sometimes the ones we make come at a much greater cost than we could ever imagine. That woman left when my father remarried. People say that, even though her in-laws drove her away, she still didn't want to leave my father. She had always been devoted to him, but fate wasn't kind. So she moved into a dilapidated house next to the old school, a house that had long since been abandoned and forgotten. It wasn't much, just a lonely shack, but she made it her home. She lived there alone, in silence, with no one but herself for company. On rare occasions, she would come to visit our house, hoping to see my father, to feel a connection to him again. But every time she came, my grandmother would shout at her, scolding her for daring to show up. She would even chase her away, calling her all sorts of hurtful names. Yet the woman persisted. She kept coming back, no matter how badly she was treated. She would stand at the door, looking at me through the cracks, her eyes full of sorrow and longing. She seemed so tired, yet so determined, and each time she would leave, her head hung low, as if knowing she would never truly return to the life she once had. She stayed in that crumbling house, living a life of solitude until the day I started kindergarten. That was when she finally left. No one knows exactly why, but it seemed as though she had finally given up hope. She had already waited so long, and perhaps she realized that she couldn't go on living like that anymore. I heard later that she moved to the city, far away from our small town. There, she worked as a laborer, doing whatever she could to survive. She remarried a widower, and together, they built a life that, at least from the outside, seemed prosperous. They had a beautiful house on a busy street and a car to go with it. People said they were very wealthy. The woman, who had once been so poor and neglected, was now living a life of comfort. It was a strange feeling to hear this. Part of me felt happy for her, but part of me couldn't help but wonder why life had turned out this way. Is it really fair? I thought. How can someone go from so much pain to so much success? I guess that's how life works. No one can predict what's going to happen, and everyone's path is different. We all have our own destinies, some filled with joy, others with sorrow. And that's something we can never truly understand. As time passed, I started to forget my biological mother's face. It was a slow process, one that I never noticed happening. But there was one thing I could never forget: her absence. I also began to remember the face of my father's ex-wife, the woman who had been there for me when I was a child. It was strange. Even though she wasn't my real mother, she had somehow become an important figure in my life. There was a photo of her that my father kept on the table, and I would often catch him staring at it in silence. He would sit there, his head bent low, and whisper things that I couldn't hear, things that seemed to weigh heavy on his heart. When she left, I saw my father's face. His eyes were red and swollen, his expression full of grief and pain. It was clear that he had loved her, even though she had left him. It was hard to understand back then, but I felt the weight of his sadness. He was a man who had been abandoned by the one woman he had once loved, and now he was left to raise me alone. A few years later, after my mother had left, she passed away. I don't remember exactly how I found out, but I knew that she was gone. My father, who had always been there for me, was now left with nothing. I grew up under his care, surrounded by his love. Despite the hardships, he always tried his best to provide for me. He taught me to be strong, to never give up, and to always work hard. He was my role model, my teacher, my protector. As I grew older, I always tried to help him. I did everything I could to make his life easier. I did the housework, helped with the farming, and focused on my studies. I wanted to make him proud, to show him that all his hard work was worth it. For many years, it was just the two of us, living a quiet, simple life. But life had a way of throwing curveballs. First, my father remarried and everything changed. I had to live with my stepmother. She wasn't a kind woman. She was bitter, cruel, and harsh. I used to think that stepmothers were only a problem in fairy tales, but I soon realized that my own stepmother was worse than any villain in those stories. She treated me as though I were a burden. She made my life miserable. Meanwhile, my half-brother, who was her biological child, did nothing but play all day. He never helped with any chores or work. It was frustrating. I worked endlessly, doing everything I could to keep the household running. I fed the cattle, went fishing, worked in the fields, and harvested the rice. Every task that needed to be done, I did it. But when it came to food, it was always different. My stepmother made sure that the best food was kept aside for her own daughter. If there was a treat, a special meal, she would save it for her, and I would be left to eat what was left over. At night, I would lie in my bed, far from the warmth of the kitchen, and think about my real mother. "Where are you, Mom? Do you still think about me? Why didn't you come back like you promised? I've waited so long. I miss you so much." The sadness would wash over me, and I would cry silently, unable to understand why life had turned out the way it did. My health began to deteriorate. Working so hard, living in such poor conditions, had taken its toll on my body. I became seriously ill. The doctors said I needed a large sum of money for treatment, but there was no money to be found. My father was desperate. He wanted to sell the house to raise the funds, but my stepmother refused. She argued fiercely, saying, "If you sell the house, where will we go? What about our daughter?" My father was torn. He knew that my life was at stake, but he also knew that selling the house would bring its own problems. "How can I sell the house?" he said. "How will we survive without it?" But he made the difficult decision. "I'll sell the house," he said. "It's the only way." My stepmother, though angry, could see that he was determined. But then, in the midst of the chaos, she suggested something else. "Why don't you contact his biological mother? Maybe she can help." My father had already tried, but there was no response. It seemed that my mother had completely abandoned us. Just when everything seemed hopeless, a kind woman came to our aid. She was not rich, but she had a heart full of compassion. She gave my father a significant amount of money, saying, "This is a small amount to help you through this difficult time. If you can repay it later, fine. If not, don't worry. The most important thing is to focus on your son's health." My father was overwhelmed with gratitude. He felt as though he had been saved from the brink of despair. "Thank you so much. I don't know how to repay you," he said. The woman smiled and replied, "It's nothing. Don't worry about it. I couldn't have children of my own, so I treat your son like my own." With the money, my father was able to take me to the hospital. I began to recover, slowly but surely. My health improved, and life started to get better. Over time, my father worked hard to save up some money, and he tried to repay the woman. But every time he offered to return the money, she refused. "That money was given to you to help your son. It was never a loan. Don't worry about it," she would say. Eventually, she called me into her home and handed me a small sum of money, saying, "This is the money that was given to us for your treatment. I want you to keep it. You don't need to repay me. It was given with love, and it will always be yours." My father and I were left speechless. The kindness and generosity of this woman, a stranger to us, was something we would never forget. It was a gesture that lifted us out of despair, and we knew that no matter what happened, we would always be grateful for her. "One day, when you go to university, you'll study hard and become successful," my father said to me. "But remember, you have an obligation to repay the sacrifices others have made for you." I nodded and answered, "Yes, Dad, I understand." "Money doesn't come easily, son. It's earned through hard work and effort, not something that falls from the sky. You must always remember that. Life is not just about receiving, it's about giving back too. Your mother and I have done so much for you. I've worked hard my whole life, and now I'm growing old. Please, one day, help repay the debts of those who've helped us along the way. Don't forget," he urged. I promised him, "I swear I won't forget, Dad. I'll make sure to repay everything." When I went to university, the money my father had given me helped cover my tuition fees. However, I had to work part-time to pay for my living expenses in the expensive city. Despite working long hours, life was tough. I was constantly struggling to make ends meet. I didn't have much time to study, and my grades began to suffer. I was failing several courses and feared that I might have to repeat a year. Worse still, my health was deteriorating rapidly. A previous illness was flaring up again, and I was feeling weak, both physically and mentally. In the midst of this crisis, I received a message on my phone. It was a notification from my bank, informing me that my account had just received 200 million Vietnamese dong. I was confused. Who had sent me this money? Was it a mistake? I checked the phone number, but it was a strange account with an unfamiliar name. Who could it be? I rushed to the bank, but the staff there couldn't tell me who had sent the money. They only advised me to use it, saying that there was no problem with the transaction. Could it be my mother? She's been living abroad for a while now. Could she have sent me money because she knew I was struggling? I wondered. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. Time passed, and I graduated with honors from a prestigious university. I was overjoyed. I thought that now, with my degree, I would finally be able to support my father and repay him for all the sacrifices he had made. But just as I was beginning to feel hopeful about the future, my father suddenly passed away. I was shocked and devastated. I didn't even know about his death until a few days later. When I returned home, my father's funeral rites had already been completed. I thought to myself, maybe he was just worn out from all the years of hard work. I didn't look into the cause of his death, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. A while after my father's passing, my aunt called me urgently. She asked me to come back home because she wanted to discuss something important. When I arrived at her house, she immediately brought up the issue of our property. "Your family's land is large, but it's in a remote area. Meanwhile, there's a house for sale nearby, right on the main road. It's worth about 1 billion Vietnamese dong. I think we should sell the property here and buy that house to live in. It'll be more convenient for your younger sibling who will need to travel to school," my aunt explained. At first I was hesitant, unsure whether this was the right decision, but then she reassured me, saying, "The new house is closer to your school and it will be better for your sibling too." I thought about it for a while and finally agreed. "Okay, Aunt, if you think it's a good idea, then I'll go along with it." She smiled and continued, "Don't worry, the extra money from selling the land will be sent back to you after we buy the new house." I was still busy with my work, so I didn't get a chance to visit the new house right away. I didn't even know where everything was placed yet, whether there was a spot for my grandmother's photo or where to keep the ancestral shrine. But life moved on. However, just a few days later, my half-sibling, the daughter of my father's second wife, called me, her voice filled with distress. "Brother, Mom left the house. She's gone. I don't know where she went. All I found was a note on the table saying that she's gone for good. There's no money left, just some rice in the pantry. I don't know what happened. Could you check if she left anything behind?" I was stunned. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It seemed like my stepmother had taken all the money from the sale of the house. The more I thought about it, the more I began to piece together the story. I remembered how my stepmother had first come into our lives. She'd kept everything hidden, meeting with my father secretly. She soon claimed she was pregnant and moved in with us. But after my father's death, I discovered that she had taken full control of everything. It was clear now that she had manipulated the situation for her own gain. I didn't know if my father's death was a result of his long years of hard labor or if something more sinister had happened. But I did suspect that my stepmother might have had a role in it. I remembered that neighbors had mentioned seeing her speak in a strange way sometimes, almost as if she was plotting something. As I reflected on everything, the truth started to become clearer. The more I tried to understand the situation, the more I saw the dark side of my aunt's behavior. She was ruthless and greedy, and it seemed that everything had been orchestrated for her own benefit. In the end, it was not just the loss of my father that hurt me the most, but the realization of how deep the betrayal ran. The money I had once thought to be a blessing was now entangled in a web of deceit, and I could no longer trust those around me. The events that followed were nothing short of a revelation. As I stood at the crossroads of my future, I realized that I would have to fight for what was rightfully mine. The sacrifices of my father were not just financial, they were personal, and I couldn't let his legacy be tainted by greed. My father was very sick for a long time before he passed away. Looking back, it makes sense. For a while before his death, every time I called home, it was always my aunt who answered the phone and talked to me. Later, I found out that the money my aunt got from selling the house was not just $1 billion as I had been told. In fact, it was far more than that. The land where our house stood was part of a development project to build a new road, which made the land highly valuable. The price was so high that my aunt took all of it for herself, without leaving a single penny for my siblings and me. Meanwhile, I was the one left to care for my younger half-sibling, a daughter of my aunt. This girl, the daughter of my aunt, was her biological child. Yet my aunt left her to me to raise without hesitation. This hurt me deeply. It revealed just how heartless she was. One day, when I returned home, my younger sibling came to me with troubling news. "Brother," she said, "the landlord told me that tomorrow we have to leave the house. They're going to lock the doors and we won't be able to stay here anymore." I was taken aback. "If that's the case," I said, "then come live with me in the city. I'll help you transfer to a new school. You can stay with me." My sibling nodded in agreement. "Yes, I'll stay with you." I reassured her. "You must behave well and focus on your studies." She promised, "I will." After working for a while, I saved up a considerable amount of money, and I began thinking about a promise I had made to my father years ago. During a break in early autumn, I decided to go back to the village for a few days. I told my younger sibling, "I have to go back to the village for a while. Can you cook for yourself while I'm gone?" She replied confidently, "I can, brother. Don't worry about me. I'm growing up now." So I headed back to my hometown, taking my father's old, worn-out motorbike from a friend's house. I asked for directions to the place where the man had once lent money to my father. I crossed a big road, took a ferry, and then traveled along a narrow path following the canal. I arrived at a small village in the Longshuyen region. It was eerily quiet, with only a few dilapidated houses along the small road. The fields were barren, with a few old trees standing crookedly in the swampy water. The water was so clear that I could see the bottom, yet the land was contaminated with salt, making it impossible for people to grow crops. It was no wonder no one planted anything here. All I could see was a thicket of wild grass and water hyacinths. Suddenly, a light rain started to fall. I pulled the bike up to a house by the road, and the woman who owned the house told me, "Just push the bike inside, take a seat, let me talk to you." I asked for directions to meet with the family of Mrs. Baduyen, the woman who had helped my father. The woman responded, "Oh, Mrs. Baduyan has been living here for over a year now. Maybe she's at home." I was puzzled. "But I heard she remarried and moved to the city." The woman laughed and said, "That's not true. She never remarried. She's just been renting a place in the city. She told people she had remarried so that your father wouldn't come looking for her." It was unbelievable that even when my father passed away, he still believed his ex-wife was living a comfortable life with a wealthy man. As I heard this, I wondered, what did she think when she took all the money my father had saved up over his lifetime and gave it to her family, a family that had once kicked her out? It was still raining lightly and I couldn't wait any longer. I set out towards Mrs. Baduyan's house, following the directions the woman had given me. The rain made the road slippery, so I had to push my bike on foot. The woman had told me that Mrs. Baduyan often went to the city for medical treatment, and I wasn't sure if she would be home. I crossed a small wooden bridge and continued walking, following the path. After a while, I reached a small house with a metal roof, which appeared new and fairly well maintained. Inside, a woman in her 60s, thin and hunched over, was feeding chickens. "Hello, Auntie," I greeted her. "Is this the house of Mrs. Baduyan?" She looked up at me, giving me a scrutinizing look. "Yes, this is her house," she replied, "but she's not here. She went to the city." I asked her, "Do you know when she'll be back?" The woman responded, "I think she'll be back soon." "What's going on? Why do you need to see her?" I explained that I had come to return the money my father had borrowed from her a long time ago. The woman stopped feeding the chickens and looked at me with curiosity. "Your father, Mr. Nguyen Van Phan, right? From Phai Thang?" I nodded. "Yes, that's right. Do you know my father?" The woman hesitated. "I've heard Mrs. Baduyan mention that your father borrowed money from her, but she said it was a gift, not a loan." I was frustrated. "No, Auntie, I have to pay this money back. It's important." The woman then gave me a piece of paper with Mrs. Baduyan's phone number on it. "When she comes back, I'll tell her you came. You can call her then." It was getting late and the sky was dark. I thanked the woman and turned to leave. As I stepped outside, the woman looked up at the sky with concern. "It's getting late and it's still raining. Why don't you stay here tonight? The road is too slippery to go anywhere. You can leave in the morning." I didn't know how to respond, so I sat down quietly, waiting. The woman started preparing dinner. As she cooked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had met her before, that her face seemed so familiar, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember from where. In no time, she served a simple meal. It was modest, but I enjoyed it immensely. The flavors reminded me of the meals my father used to cook, the simple dishes, the way he seasoned them. It was all so familiar. As I ate, I noticed that the woman often looked at me, not like a host looks at a guest, but more like a mother watches her child eating, savoring the meal she made. Could it be that this woman was Mrs. Baduyan? To test my suspicion, I decided to ask about a dish she had prepared. "This dish, did you add a little soy sauce?" She looked at me with a slight smile, not answering immediately. But the expression on her face was enough to make my heart race. Something felt deeply familiar about her, as if she had been a part of my life all along. Was she Mrs. Baduyan? I didn't know for sure, but I could feel that the truth was much closer than I had ever imagined. "It's really nice, isn't it, Auntie Ba?" "Ah, yes. I was in a rush and forgot." The homeowner accidentally let it slip without realizing the change in how I addressed her. Then, she walked toward the corner of the house, moving a pile of belongings aside to pull out a fresh bottle of soy sauce. Ah, this is it. The person who looks after the house wouldn't have known that there was a bottle of soy sauce hidden away in such a discreet spot. Now, I had a chance to closely observe the woman preparing the meal, struggling to open the bottle, her large, round eyes, the same face as the girl in the photo my father kept on the table. I waited for Auntie Ba to pour some soy sauce into a small plate. Slowly, I said, "I need to say this, and I hope you won't be upset with me. I know you're not really from the city, but you've been sitting right here in front of me the whole time." A brief moment of confusion flashed across her face, as though she didn't expect her true identity to be uncovered by a guest. The ex-wife of my father looked at me with a longing gaze. "When we first met, I knew who you were right away," she replied softly. "Now that you know, I'll just tell you, don't worry about the money. You don't have to return it. Consider it a gift from me on your wedding day." I was taken aback. "But Auntie, I know this money means a lot to you. It isn't just any money. It's the sweat and tears from years of hard work, years of laboring for others. You even had to borrow some to make it, right? Please accept it back. I want to keep my promise to the one who's gone." Auntie Ba was silent for a moment, looking down at the soy sauce she had just poured. She sighed softly and began speaking. "Yes, that money. It's what I saved up for years. I did have to borrow some to make ends meet, but I paid it all back. I've managed to save up a little bit now, though it's not much. It's enough to get by in my old age." I couldn't hold back my curiosity anymore. "But Auntie, what about the 200 million Vietnamese dong that was transferred to my account under the name Stranger when I was in university? Where did that money come from?" She paused, as if considering whether to answer. Then she quietly said, "That money was from some relatives on my side. They sold land and gave me a share." Before I could ask anything else, she quickly changed the subject. "Do you know, last year I quit my job because I felt I was getting too old? The owners begged me to stay, but the kids wanted me to keep cooking for them every day. I think they got used to my cooking, but I felt like I wasn't even a relative, and yet they wanted me to stay and take care of them indefinitely. So I made the decision to return to my hometown." As I listened to her, I could imagine her life, her years spent with my father, and how happy she must have been back then. But that happiness was overshadowed by the old-fashioned belief that a woman should have children to continue the family line. I pictured the day she had to leave my father's house, carrying her bag with her belongings, shedding quiet tears. I wondered, when she left, did she ever hope for a reunion with my father? Or had she sworn to never meet him again after all he had done to her? "Did you know, Auntie Ba," I asked, my voice soft, "that after my father passed, no one remembered you anymore? You're the one who placed those roses on his grave every year, on the anniversary of his death." The woman, who had been cast out of her husband's house, didn't answer me immediately. Instead, she began to weep softly, her heart heavy with memories. "You don't know," she began, her voice trembling, "but after I left your father's house, I wanted to end it all. But then I thought, if I died, it would hurt me, but it would hurt my loved ones even more. Your father still loved me very much. That's why I sent him messages, to let him know I was still here. He had always been worried that he might find me." By now, the night had fallen. The meal was still sitting on the table untouched. The woman, having lost her husband, was lost in memories of her first love, her one and only love. She remembered the young man from the countryside, the one who had stolen her heart, and how they had been so in love. They were like two peas in a pod, the beautiful young girl from the river delta and the hard-working man. Now both of them were gone, my father and she, while my mother was far away in another country. Only I remained, alone in this world without close relatives or family. Auntie Ba had sacrificed so much for my father and me. It was a silent, selfless sacrifice, given without expectation of anything in return. She didn't want to break the flow of her memories, so I quietly listened as she shared her story. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "when I heard that your mother had given birth to you, I was so happy. It was as if I had a child of my own. Sometimes I would count how old you were, how many months you were, and wonder how you were growing up." For a moment there was a pause, and then Auntie Ba looked up at me, her eyes filled with concern. "How are things in the city? Do you lack anything?" I reassured her. "I'm doing well. I've been working, and my salary is decent. I'm not lacking anything." She asked again, "Is it far to your workplace? Do you eat out or cook for yourself? Is everything all right?" Her questions, though simple, moved me deeply. I realized for the first time that I had never been truly alone. The ex-wife of my father, Auntie Ba, had always been watching over me. She had cared for me from afar, always thinking of me as her own child, always concerned for my well-being. I felt an invisible bond connecting my life to hers, this woman who wasn't even related by blood, yet had given me so much. I gently set my bowl down on the table and suggested, "Auntie, I've been thinking. You don't have any family here, and the living conditions aren't ideal. Why don't you come to the city to live with me? I can take care of you." She hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether to take the offer. There was a look of doubt on her face, but I could see that she was considering it. Not wanting to disturb anyone, I gently approached her and took her thin, frail hand, earnestly begging her, "Please, Ba, be the mother to me. Please be my mother, Ba." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the darkness outside, as if she were lost in the painful memories of her past. Perhaps she was recalling the difficult years of her life, or maybe she was remembering the happier times spent with my father, yearning for the days when she had hoped to be a mother herself, dreaming of holding a child she had given birth to. As I stood there, I could see tears silently streaming down her gaunt cheeks, her face a reflection of the sadness of a mother who had never borne a child. But then, in a sudden, surprising movement, she turned toward me. She opened her arms wide and pulled me into an embrace, her voice choked with emotion. "My dear, we finally had a child. Our child. He looks so much like you." They reached an intersection, hailed a taxi, and got in. As the car drove away, I noticed my little sister still staring after them. After all, they were her parents. She was always so well behaved, and she held them dear, even though she didn't want to follow them. She only wanted to stay with me. In truth, if Ha weren't my father's daughter, then Ha and I would just be strangers with no blood connection whatsoever. But now, Ha had grown up. Our family's small rental apartment was getting cramped and inconvenient for all of us. I discussed with my mother, Duyen, about moving to a bigger place. "Mom, tomorrow I'll go rent a bigger apartment for us. It's getting too tight here, don't you think?" I said. Duyen looked at me and asked, "I have something to ask, but please don't get upset, okay?" "Of course not, Mom. What is it?" "How much have you saved up so far?" she asked, her tone cautious. "About 1 billion VND, Mom. Why do you ask?" I replied, a little surprised. "Well, I'm thinking of selling the house and land back in the countryside. With your savings, I think we can buy an apartment," she explained. I wasn't sure how to respond right away. Before I could say anything, Duyen continued, "But even with everything, I don't think it will be enough, son. The land isn't worth much. Even if I sold the house and the land, we wouldn't have 1 billion in cash. After everything, I'd have just about 100 million Vietnamese dong left." She sighed deeply, the weight of helplessness and exhaustion clear on her face. Her once youthful expression was now worn and lined with time. I comforted her. "Don't worry, Mom. One day we'll have our own house. We'll be fine." But Duyen was still upset, her worry heavy in the air. "Everything is on your shoulders now, son. Has about to go to university. I'm getting older and can't help you with anything. I don't want you to carry all of this alone." "Mom, don't think like that," I said gently. "I'll work extra hours, save up more, and take care of both of you. Be careful, son. Don't push yourself too hard. Your health is more important than money. Remember, money can't buy health," she warned, a note of concern in her voice. "I know, Mom," I nodded. "I'll be careful. I'm leaving for work now. You and Ha stay home. I'll see you later." "Drive safely," she said. That evening, after work, I met up with a friend for coffee. As we reached the cafe, my phone rang. It was my mom. "Hello?" I answered. "Son, come home. There's someone here who wants to meet you," Duyen said. "Who is it, Mom?" I asked, a little confused. "Just come home. You'll find out when you get here." "All right, I'm on my way," I said, hanging up. I told my friend I had to leave and headed back. On the way, my mind raced. Who could possibly want to meet me at this hour? Was it related to work? Or someone from the past? It couldn't be a relative, could it? Maybe it was that greedy person again, coming to ask for something. I had no idea what to expect. When I arrived home, I saw a young woman, about Hayes' age, standing by the door. Next to her was an older woman, perhaps in her 60s. They both looked up when I entered. The older woman asked right away, "Which one of you is son?" "I am," I replied, feeling a bit uneasy. "What can I help you with?" Without saying a word, the woman stepped forward and suddenly hugged me tightly. Her body shook with sobs. Her tears soaked my shoulder, and I could feel the warmth of her sorrow seeping into me. Duyan, standing nearby, whispered in my ear, "This is your real mother, son." My heart skipped a beat. Was this truly my mother, the one who had abandoned me when I was just a young schoolboy? The one who never once reached out to me during all those years of sickness and pain? The one I had needed so desperately in those moments of agony, longing for comforting words from her? And now she was here, standing before me, crying. "Why did you leave me, Mom? Why did you disappear for so many years?" I asked, unable to contain the flood of emotions. "I've been through so much. Why now, after all this time?" "I'm so sorry, son," she choked out, her voice full of regret. "I had my own struggles. If I could have, I would have taken you with me, but your father and grandmother wouldn't let me. I had no choice but to leave." "Mom, I don't understand. Why did you leave us like that?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I know, it was wrong, but your father and grandmother, they loved you. I saw how much they cared for you, but I couldn't take you with me. I didn't have anything to offer," she explained, her voice filled with sorrow. I could see the pain in her eyes, but a sense of bitterness started to rise in me. "And what about her?" I gestured toward the young girl standing next to my real mother. "Is she your daughter? Why is she here?" The woman looked at me and said softly, "Yes, she's my daughter. I know this must be hard for you, son, but don't be upset. After all, we're both family, and she's your sister, too." I almost blurted out that this wasn't the same as having a true family, but I stopped myself. It seemed unnecessary to say such things. "So, how long have you been back in Vietnam?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "I've only been here a few days. I'll be leaving soon for a few more days, but I'll return next year." "Maybe I'll stay a little longer then," she replied. "Why don't you stay here for a while? Even though it's small, it's fine. You're welcome to stay here," I offered. Duyen spoke up. "The house is cramped, but it's better than nothing. Why not look for another place?" My real mother smiled faintly. "It's all right. I'll stay here for now. Just don't worry about me." For the past few days, I've been thinking about moving out with my parents. The place we are living in now is just too small and too inconvenient. It's difficult to even breathe here sometimes. If there's anything lacking, Mom is always there to help. My mother and I have been talking about buying a new house with the savings we've accumulated over the years. Mom and I pooled together our savings, and she even sold some land in the countryside, but it still wasn't enough. One evening, out of nowhere, Mom gave me a secretive wink, signaling that she wanted to talk privately. She gestured for me to step outside. "How much have you saved so far?" she asked. She had no idea how much I had set aside by then, and she seemed concerned. "Don't worry," she continued. "I'll help you. I can give you 2 billion Vietnamese dong to help with the house. You can buy a house in a small alley if needed, but make sure you don't use any money from Du Yen. It'll cause too many problems later." That night, I ended up sleeping beside Mom. Mom Du Yen, my stepmother, and my half-brother, who shared a different father, slept on another bed. It had been nearly 20 years since I last lay next to Mom, and I couldn't stop myself from sharing everything. I told her about my health problems, about how I had suffered from skin conditions, and how Du Yen had silently helped me during the toughest times. Mom listened quietly, Then she shared a painful chapter of her own life. She revealed that it wasn't because she had abandoned me for another man. The truth was far more heart-wrenching. She had willingly sold herself into marriage with a Chinese man to save my little brother, who was very ill and needed a large sum of money for heart surgery. My maternal family had no money to help, and my grandmother had pleaded with her to save my brother's life. Mom had gone abroad, becoming the wife of this foreign man, who in time grew fond of her. She bore him 2 children. However, every time Mom tried to visit her hometown, he refused, fearing that she might never return. Only when the children grew older did he agree, but with one condition. Mom could return, but only with one of her children. A few days later, Mom had to leave for her hometown to handle some paperwork related to the land sale. Before she left, she reminded me to keep looking for a house. "Look for one around 4 billion Vietnamese dong," she told me. Several days passed, and when Duyen returned, I had found a house that met our needs. The owner was in a hurry to sell because they were moving abroad, and the price was reasonable, fitting within our budget. However, when it came time to finalize the ownership papers, my mother and Duyen started to argue again. I wanted the house to be co-owned by all 3 of us, myself, my mother, and Duyen. But Duyen only wanted my name and hers on the deed, and Mom, who was getting older, didn't want to be involved in any complications later. "I'm too old now," she said. "If my name is on the papers, what if later my relatives come and ask for a share of the property? I don't want to cause trouble for you 2. But I insisted. "This house belongs to all 3 of us. Even though Duyen and I are not blood siblings, she has been with me through thick and thin. She's my sister in every way that matters." Duyen hesitated. "I'm not contributing anything to the house. You've been generous enough to let me stay here and study. You don't need to put my name on the deed." I could understand her point. After all, Duyen wasn't in a position to contribute financially, but in my heart, I knew this house was not just about the money. It was about family, unity, and the sacrifices we had all made. After a long discussion, I finally convinced Duyen that this was a matter of family. "I've made it clear to you that I treat you like a sibling," I said. "You're staying here because we care about you. You're as much a part of this as Mom and me." But still, Duyen didn't want to be on the deed. She was worried that later, if my mother's relatives came and asked for a share, it would create unnecessary complications. "I understand," I said. "But this house is a place where we can all live together, with no division. You have to trust me on this." As for my mother, I couldn't back down. I told her, "Mom, you've done so much for me. You've always been there for me, even though you didn't give birth to me. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even be alive today. You are more than just my mother. You're like my second birth mother." But even then, Mom insisted, "I don't need to be on the deed. I don't care about the house. All I want is to live peacefully with you in my final years." It was painful for me to hear that, but I respected her decision. In the end, I was the only one whose name appeared on the deed. Sometime later, I met a girl at work and we started dating. She too was an orphan, and I was relieved to know she understood my situation. We were about to get married, and before we did, I had to make one thing very clear. You know, Duyan isn't my real mother, but she is more than just a stepmother to me. She's been like a mother to me in every way that counts. I want you to treat her like your own mother once we're married." She agreed, saying, "Any mother who's good to her child must also love the people around her. I'll treat her like my own mother." And it was true. When we finally moved in together, I could see how well Duyen and my wife got along. They were a perfect match, and both of them made me feel blessed. Everyone says that my mother-in-law and I are like 2 close biological mothers and daughters. They always wonder how we get along so well, how sweet and caring we are for each other. When my wife was about to give birth to our baby, my mother, Duyen, was overjoyed beyond words. She kept urging me to prepare this and that, as if she had been through childbirth many times herself. Although she was getting older, my mother-in-law was always eager to go to the market, buying special ingredients and nourishing foods to help my wife recover after the birth. She would often say to me, "Childbirth is painful and exhausting, you know. You need to love and care for your wife more than ever now." I would reply, "Yes, I know, Mom." She would add, "Don't let her do too much work. She needs to rest. If you need help, just call me. Don't hesitate." I promised her that I would support my wife with everything, from caring for the baby to everything else. However, despite my promises, I noticed that the majority of the work in taking care of the baby was handled by my mother. Whenever she had free time, she would rush to my house to take care of the baby. She would rock the cradle and sing lullabies to help the baby sleep peacefully. Even after the baby had fallen asleep, my mother would sit there, watching over the child, a look of immense happiness on her face. Perhaps because she was unable to have children of her own, my mother had an even deeper love for babies and an immense sympathy for women who had just given birth. She would often say to me, "Your child looks just like you, and also like your father. I still remember your father's face so clearly. How could I ever forget? I still keep a picture of him from his younger days, and I carry it with me. Your father also cherishes a picture of me. We always keep each other in our hearts. Look at this," she would point to our baby, "the little mouth puckered just like yours when you were a child. I remember when you were born, your grandmother would come to check on you every time I left the house. She'd just look at you for a while and leave. You know, she always told me, if I could have taken you with me, you wouldn't have had to suffer with these people later." "Ha, you're impossible." I would laugh, teasing her. "Back then, you just wanted to run away with me. But in the end, Mom, you're the best. No one will ever love me as much as you do." And it's true. Thanks to my mother's help, my wife and I were able to get through the challenges of caring for a newborn more easily. On top of that, my sister Ha would always rush home from school, eager to hold the baby, chat with the little one, and take care of everything. There were moments when I had to remind her not to get too distracted from her studies. Years passed, and my sister Ha graduated from university. She was about to get married to a man from a distant place in the central region. I could see that my mother, Du Yan, was very sad. I think she shared my feelings about watching a beloved child leave the home to start a life of her own, far from the family. Moreover, my mother had been a daughter-in-law herself and had suffered much from her own in-laws, which likely made her worried about the future for Ha. But I reassured her, saying, "Mom, times have changed. Old, outdated beliefs are no longer as common as before. Everything will be fine." The day before Ha's wedding, my wife and I gave her a gift, a gold necklace, as a dowry. I told her, "This gold is from us to you on your wedding day. We've grown up together, and no matter where you go, you will always be our little sister. This house will always be your home. Whenever you want to come back, we will always welcome you." At the same time, my mother took out some gold pieces and handed them to Ha. "This is the gold I received from my parents when I got married," she said. "I've kept it all these years, and now I'm giving it to you. I wish you happiness with the person you love. No matter where you go, always remember you can come back home to visit me and your brother whenever you like." Ha was deeply moved. Her eyes welled up with tears as she sobbed. Her voice trembled as she said, "I've always had a father and mother, but it felt like I was orphaned. I was so fortunate to have you both, my brother and my mother, who raised me and made sure I had everything I needed. The love and care you've given me will stay in my heart forever. Even though we're not connected by blood, our bond is stronger than anything, closer than some families can even imagine." Mother Duyin wiped the tears from Ha's face and said, "Yes, my dear. You're part of our family, and no matter what happens in your married life, always remember that we are here for you. You will always have us, your mom and your brother, who love you deeply. You will always be welcomed home with open arms, as if you've never left." Ha, still teary-eyed, promised, "I'll never forget what you've told me. I'll always remember the love you've given me." Later, for work and other reasons, Ha's family moved to a new city. but every weekend she and her family would come over to our place to visit. Whenever Ha's child would appear, my own child would be thrilled. They would run around, bringing me little things, running back and forth. If something wasn't quite right, they would immediately run to their parents to report it. The children played together all day long, and when it was time to say goodbye, there was always a sense of longing. They would hug each other and promise to meet again next week. Every time this happened, my mother was overjoyed. She would smile and say, "This is what family is all about: love, connection, and warmth." She felt such happiness in seeing her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My mother, despite all the challenges she faced in life, found fulfillment in her family. She felt her love for her children and grandchildren reflected in their smiles. For a woman who could not bear children of her own, the joy of seeing her family come together was the greatest blessing. Through her selflessness, she had created a full and happy family, with children, sons, daughters, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. My father often told me that life is harder than we realize, and we should never envy others. There is nothing more valuable than the love and connection we share with our family. There was a little girl, a small lost child with no parents. She was brought home by my grandmother during one of her train trips from Saigon. My grandmother told me that when she first saw the girl, she was wandering aimlessly at the train station, looking confused and lost. Her clothes were torn and she was covered in dirt. My grandmother's heart went out to her. She asked the girl what happened, but to her surprise, the girl burst into tears and begged to come with her. The girl didn't know why she was there or even what her name was. From that day on, my peaceful life was turned upside down. At first, it was little things, like the beautiful dolls that my mother had given me. She told me, let her play with them too, and the box of building blocks that I always kept carefully stored in a cardboard box. My father told me, play together. But what frustrated me the most was how she never asked. She didn't even ask to play with me. Instead, she would just stand there, staring at me with her wide, round eyes. Was she eyeing all my toys? I thought, not a chance. It was only when I started school that my father gave her a name, Ngan. From then on, everyone started calling her Be Ngan or Little Ngan. She gradually became familiar with her new name. Whenever she was called Ngan Oi, her face would light up with a big smile. She started calling my grandmother Ba and my father Bo, just like me. How sweet was that? But there were times when I couldn't hold back my frustration. I would snap at her, Ba la kwa toi, bo la kwa toi. Grandmother's mine, father's mine. I would point to the mountains far off in the distance and say, look over there, that's my home. And she would just stand there, confused, looking at me with her soft eyes. After a while, she began to understand her place and quietly accepted it. She even asked me if she could live with my family, and I, though reluctant, allowed it. Our village where we lived was filled with rows of beautiful trees, including the fragrant Zoan flowers in full bloom during the second month of the year. The road was lined with purple petals, falling like soft shells, scattered across the stone pavement. The green fences of Cuse tan plants grew lush and thick, soaking up the gentle spring rain. The golden threads of day to Hong flowers entwined with each other, catching the delicate purple petals. Ngan and I often played together in the fields, pretending to be princesses. She loved to make me the princess, saying I could wear a golden crown made of tresses of day to Hong, the soft silk-like flowers. She would carefully decorate me, then step back, looking at me, smiling brightly, and say, you look just like a princess. I would try to act sophisticated and walk into the yard, but Ngan wasn't satisfied with just that. She would take handfuls of Zoan flowers and scatter them over my shoulders, laughing, move aside, the princess is coming. Meanwhile, the dog would bark excitedly, running around us, its paws skidding across the wet ground. But when I offered to let her be the princess, she shook her head and said, "I can't. I'm too ugly. Only you can be the princess." She added, "I'm just the servant of the princess." The months passed, and soon the days of blooming zone flowers were gone. We had both grown, and now we were in our 9th year of school. Around this time, my grandmother started to fall ill. She coughed a lot, and her once strong presence in the house became quieter. Our daily meals weren't as lavish as before. My father would often sit thoughtfully after coming home from work, and my mother took on all the farming duties by herself. Ngan and I helped my father with the farm after school. We worked hard together, but when the evening came, we still had to study. "This is your final year," my father would say. "Focus on your studies. You need to do your best." Even though we weren't in the same class, Ngan and I both understood the importance of getting good grades. We didn't make a pact, but we both worked hard to get good marks so our father would be proud. Even though we were in different classes, we knew the results of each other's exams. I was in Class A and Ngan was in Class C. When graduation came, all the students were nervous about the exams, but Ngan and I were relaxed. We joked with our friends, saying, "Don't worry, we'll do fine." However, when the exam results came, my world seemed to stop. Ngan hadn't passed into high school. I couldn't believe it. I rushed to tell my father, and he immediately dropped everything, jumping on his bike and speeding down to the school. My mother was stunned. "Why didn't Ngan pass? What happened?" she asked. My grandmother sighed deeply and then coughed again. "Poor thing," she muttered. "It's fate. She's unlucky." She started coughing again, more violently this time. I looked at Ngan's sad face and asked her what happened. She simply replied, "I got a failing grade." My father came back from the school with a heavy heart, his face weary. "It's true," he said. "She failed." He explained that Ngan had gotten a failing grade in one subject. It was a subject she had always been good at, geography. How could this happen? I thought. Ngan was always a good student, and sometimes even better than I was. She had no trouble with her lessons. Determined to find out the truth, I decided to investigate. A friend of ours told me that Ngan had copied the exam questions, but she had simply sat there, crying quietly without attempting to answer. The exam proctor had asked her why she hadn't finished, and she had said she didn't understand the questions. I was furious. I rushed home, grabbed her, and pulled her aside, demanding, "Why did you purposely fail the geography exam?" At first, she hesitated. "I don't remember the lessons," she lied. But then I shouted, "You're lying! Why didn't you finish the exam? You know you can do better. What's really going on?" She looked down, her tears streaming down her face. I wanted to stay home and help my father. Grandma is sick, and I wanted to stay with her." Her words hit me like a bolt of lightning. She had sacrificed her own future to stay by my side, to help out around the house. I was overcome with emotion. You wanted to stay home to help? To let me go to school while you stayed behind?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized the depth of her love for me. At that moment, my father, who had been standing quietly behind us, finally spoke. His voice was low, and when I turned around, I saw his eyes were also red.